Hi everyone, welcome back to English 484W. So this lecture, I'm going to try to keep things a little bit shorter to give you guys more time to work on your essays. I know we're finally having some pretty good weather, so obviously it's a great time to be stuck at home writing an essay. But yeah, I'm going to try to keep this short. The thing that I wanted to start talking today about was this documentary that I watched this weekend, and it was called The People's Republic of Desire. It was a 2018 documentary about the culture of live streaming in China. And there's just a couple of interesting things that I thought were kind of relevant to the course that made me think a little bit. So in China, there's kind of a very big culture of watching people live stream, and live stream meaning just showing kind of everyday things that they do in their life. Some of these people do kind of sing or make jokes, but the live streaming is there to kind of just document kind of even very boring things that these people are doing. And they get audiences in the thousands upon thousands for just watching them eat a bowl of noodles or something like that. So there's this kind of human interaction depicted in this film, which I think is the Western version of it is maybe the relationship of simping, which is where these audiences of men and women, I think, watch these kind of live streamers or major social media personalities, and they donate money, they donate their eyeballs to them. There's just this human relationship that's kind of on these social media platforms that's a little bit transactional, but also very kind of popular. And so why is it popular? So the film did kind of document some of the reasons for that, I thought, in terms of just the general kind of culture of loneliness that I think maybe even during the virus right now that we're experiencing in kind of even more exaggerated fashion. So in China, there's obviously the Chinese kind of work culture, which is a little bit more intense, I think, than the Western work culture. So one of the characters in the film, he talked about how he gets 2 days off a month, so from work. So there's not a lot of time for kind of forming real kind of, I guess, genuine or authentic human friendships or relationships. So when he's tired from work, it's a lot easier to just kind of interact with this live streamer. And he does kind of talk about it as generating a sense of intimacy, which is lacking from his everyday life. So there are kind of social outside reasons for the kind of intimacies or relationships that we favor today with social media personalities. I think the Western version of that is kind of like the simping thing that goes on, where these kind of social media personalities, again, they have these kind of massive audiences who donate money to them or who just watch them a lot. And yeah, it's kind of a transactional form of human relationships. But the character in the film also kind of talked about a declining sense of social mobility. So people forming relationships based on other people's achievements or their kind of class status, and this making it difficult for this person to kind of formulate a relationship because he was young and he didn't have any kind of achievements or anything like that. So I think this is a little bit relevant to you in that you depicts a kind of a lower class character interacting with these kind of more upper class people such as Peach and also even Beck a little bit. So there is kind of a class element to the relationship. Obviously the way that Joe handles that class relationship is very problematic, but at the same time some of his angst does come out of that not feeling as good or good enough for these kind of people that Beck interacts with. So just kind of a personal thing, kind of building off that film that I watched. I mean, I do kind of participate in kind of live streaming activities, I guess, especially during the quarantine. So I got into this app called Spoon, which is kind of just like this DJ kind of app where a DJ kind of plays music and interacts with what I liked about it was these kind of smaller crowds of people, so like 15 to 20 people. So it does feel a little bit more intimate. We were kind of talking earlier in the course about kind of better social media apps and worse social media apps for generating human connection. So I do sometimes think that an app like Spoon, with its like kind of smaller crowds and not as kind of transactional based, even though you do give likes or you do give spoons, which are kind of a currency. sometimes I also kind of worry about it, that it is, even though it kind of fosters the illusion of connection, there's still kind of I don't know, a transactional component to it that at the end of the day kind of favors disconnection over connection. And just kind of a more general point. So Spoon, I've noticed a lot of the kind of the DJ rooms, a lot of them kind of talk about relationship issues, or like talk to me about your crushes, or talk to me about your breakup, or just talk to me about relationships. And even on something like TikTok, a lot of TikTok also, maybe it's just my page, it's being designed for me, is based around human relationships. So there's a lot of kind of TikToks that I see where there's a person kind of presenting themselves as a dating option, or even I've seen a TikTok documenting a breakup, or there's even like a popular TikTok, I think, for like relationship advice. So a lot of our issues, or the way that we handle relationships today, does seem to be being outsourced a lot to these kind of apps. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, maybe that's not as interesting of a question as whether it's kind of a necessary thing. Whether we are, I know most of you, from just talking to you, a lot of you are working at the same time as you're going to school. So you're obviously very busy, and maybe that kind of busyness has effects in kind of other areas of life. And one of those would be kind of generating or feeling intimacy with other people, or generating kind of authentic, genuine, caring relationships with other people. So even though kind of we turn to these social media apps for intimacy or connection, maybe it's not so interesting to evaluate these apps as much as it is to kind of evaluate the society that makes us turn to these apps for help with intimacy or connection. So yeah, that's just kind of my opening. I just wanted to briefly talk about that before kind of getting into the text. And I also kind of wanted to talk about the additional secondary source that we're reading this week. So the one that talks about the TV show You. And yeah, one of the more interesting things in that article, which I found, I think the whole article was actually really great. So please check it out if you haven't checked it out yet. But I'm just going to read a long quote from the article that I thought was very useful. One salient example of this reassertion of masculine surveillance and authority may be found in Joe's critique of / disdain for women's use of social media. After meeting Beck, Joe's first creep move is to find her online, perpetuating the common notion that women's participation in online spaces is dangerous to them, when having an online presence, particularly for an aspiring writer, is more and more necessary in the neoliberal economy. So not only is Beck naive about the information that she shares publicly online because she wants to be seen, heard, she is also careless with her devices. Neither her phone nor her laptop computer are password protected. Within this logic, being tech savvy for women also means being appropriately private. Beck's risky behaviors delegitimize her tech savvy, positioning her as a naive and endangered user of technology who needs and deserves a lesson in privacy management. Joe's voiceover on this topic again may cue young women to question their own interactions with technology. Building on these logics, Joe also critiques women's content production, with Beck and her friends repeatedly shown as using platforms in ways he does not approve of. There's a bolder, gendered negativity toward young women's engagement with technology, their taking of selfies to be seen and followed, and their monetization. After lurking on all of her publicly accessible social media accounts, Joe surmises, your online life isn't real. It's a collage. You paste this back up, this together lovable, cute, bendy little creature. Joe's critique is not just that Beck uses social media to be seen, but also that she presents an inauthentic version of herself to the world, a complaint that has long been lodged against women, particularly those who partake in hegemonic beautification practices. In this way, the show piggybacks on wider misogynistic cliches about women's narcissism and superficiality. So Joe's critique here of Beck's kind of inauthenticity of her social media profile, I mean, this kind of connects back to a question that I posed in the Zoom, whether and this is kind of building off Ria's presentation still, whether the more dangerous fantasy of Joe is that Beck's social media profile presents kind of a version of her that he can kind of learn from. So there is a kind of a degree of authenticity in that Joe can kind of learn about her behaviors and then begin to manipulate her. Or if the more dangerous fantasy is that there is kind of that all this social media profiles are kind of inauthentic, that there's a real back behind this, that it is up to Joe to kind of investigate and uncover, and he does so obviously very violently. So Joe's critique here of Beck's social media practices, I mean, we can kind of take the critically distant position of, yeah, this is bad. But I mean, I'm curious to hear from you guys whether you do kind of ever kind of partake in this kind of similar criticism of the lives that people present online. I'm sure there is sometimes that you think that a person posting a selfie or maybe posting a bunch of selfies, you do kind of wonder, is this narcissistic? So yeah, I am curious whether you guys kind of ever agree with Joe's critique of Beck's social media use. But Joe's critique of Beck also kind of dovetails with kind of a larger kind of, I think, more kind of general critique of women's social media use. And a lot of this does come out of like platforms like 4chan. And in her book, Kill All Normies, which was kind of a controversial book, Angela Nagel kind of talked about this, especially the term, the attention whore word that Joe uses to describe Beck on page 13 and in my version. And it's kind of a quote that we've talked about a little bit in the Discord. So this, just to read a quote from Angela Nagel: "Women who find themselves called attention-seeking whores with regularity in forums that identify as transgressive and countercultural are usually guilty of slipping up and not getting the subcultural conventions." So she's talking about 4chan here. "They are seen to display female vanity, which is violently rejected in Chan culture because it is the defining feature of so much of mainstream social media and online culture, in which networks such as Instagram and Facebook are based around personal identity and photographs. It is against these massified and feminized networks that these subcultures aggressively seek to defend their borders." So forums like 4chan, which are kind of very misogynistic, they are very different from something like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, basically because all the users are anonymous. It is kind of a way of preventing or defending against this kind of social media vanity that these people really kind of despise. And this is kind of like the extreme on like 4chan of like despising women's use of social media. But again, I think it is kind of a more general or kind of social phenomenon as well. So yeah, so that word of attention whore, I mean, that is kind of an interesting word, especially how it's come up in this course a couple times. So when we were reading Cat Person, what is the moment where we realize that Robert is a horrible person? It's when he uses that word. And I mean, that word has obviously a long kind of history in terms of being used to kind of insult women, especially kind of as a way of controlling their behaviors. And now it's just kind of reached this kind of like updated stage for kind of the internet age, where we can still kind of use that word with all its kind of power to, as it is historically done, to kind of place a limit on the behavior of women. But now we have a way to do that for the internet. We can kind of seek to control the way that women post on social media by insulting them with this word. And it is kind of a very gendered word. I mean, I don't know if you guys can think of if it would, like the word attention whore could be applied to men. I mean, just looking at one of the men in this course, Dao Lin. So Dao Lin was very kind of self-promotional as an author. One of his little stunts was putting pictures of Britney Spears with, I think, his novel's name attached to it all over the offices of BuzzFeed. He did indulge in these kind of like self-promotional stunts, and they were kind of criticized, but they weren't criticized with that word. So it is a word that is gendered, I think, and it keeps popping up in you. That, yeah, it is kind of a very gendered kind of insult. And I mean, so women taking selfies, which is kind of if you go on any kind of social media platform, I think you're going to see a lot of women taking selfies. And what is our explanation of this activity? I mean, one of the explanations is that it's kind of a practice that's been going on for a long time. So even like a painter like Van Gogh, one of his main activities was painting self-portraits. I mean, he painted, I think, tens upon tens of self-portraits. And would Van Gogh be called an attention whore because he was interested in self-representation? I don't think so. I mean, um, I think there is kind of a way where our kind of social media usage does kind of lend itself toward a certain narcissism. And the way that I thought through this was there was a recent movie called Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and that movie kind of revolved around the self-portrait or a portrait of a woman being done for her kind of selling off to a kind of marriage market. So in this kind of self-portrait activity, there was kind of this dialogue between the painter and the woman being painted that kind of progressed as the film went on. So in that kind of representation of someone, there was like a dialogical element to it, meaning that it was kind of interpersonal, whereas anyone can kind of just take a selfie by themselves, and maybe there isn't that kind of dialogical or interpersonal element to it that is depicted in the Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you guys kind of think about kind of selfie culture. I mean, it is one of the things that kind of Joe is criticizing, I think, in this book. But I mean, you also have to kind of look at the historical background to kind of representation. I mean, there's the expression "the male gaze" in film from Laura Mulvey, and she kind of talks about how pretty much every film made or mainstream film made depicts women from the gaze of a masculine kind of perspective. So, and when we're looking at literature as well, there's kind of, I think, a male gaze operative perhaps in literature as well, or at least we're kind of more exposed to kind of perspectives from men, especially if we're reading kind of classical literature. There's a lot of male perspective, there's not as many woman perspectives. So that weight of that history, when it comes to self-representation or understanding of oneself, of course, I think turning to kind of selfies or turning to the kind of the narcissistic writing perhaps of Marie Calloway or self-obsessed. I mean, there's a reason for that because there aren't as many kind of interesting or complex representations of women as there are of men, at least from a kind of a historical perspective. Okay, so yeah, so talking about that kind of this is not a great segue, but talking about film and books, I just wanted to do a quick kind of brief discussion of the media preferences of each of these characters, what it might say about them, and this was kind of something that was talked about in the Discord quite a bit. So Marshall McLuhan was a kind of an influential Canadian media theorist, and he had this idea that, I'm just quoting him here, all media are active metaphors in their power to translate experience into new form. So every kind of new media that we get, it's not just kind of a tool that we can use, but it also kind of transforms our experience along the lines of the way that that media form is structured. So people start experiencing life more. All right, just as an example, Dao Lin had this quote about how he thinks in tweets. So his brain kind of thinks in tweets. And that's just because he uses that media platform a lot. It doesn't just kind of offer a way of presenting the world to him, but it also kind of changes his thought patterns even. So there's a couple characters in You that a lot is kind of said about them by the media objects that they use. So as was kind of discussed in the Discord this week, Joe is kind of obsessed with older cultural artifacts. He seems to hate new books like The Doctor Sleep by Stephen King that comes out. He hates the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code, but then he loves it later for some reason. And he is kind of counteropposed to Beck, who Beck has this obsession with everything new. So she likes new guys constantly. She likes new laptops. I think she has like 3 laptops and like 2 phones. And she also kind of likes new clothes. There's a little bit about how she likes returning clothes that she already bought and then getting new ones very soon. And then eventually, I kind of talked about this last week, but Joe eventually, his preference for books, the way that he thinks via the book medium, it culminates in him turning Beck into a book, and that's called the Book of Beck. So that's on page 374. You burrow through my things that you think of as your things, and now you find my pièce de résistance, the Book of Beck. You should be flattered that a stand-up guy like me, who's smarter than most guys, is creating a tribute to you. So even though at the very end of the novel, Joe is successfully converted Beck into a book, I mean, and even when I'm saying that, I mean, Beck sounds a little bit like book. So it is kind of the Book of Beck. Maybe it's kind of foreshadowed in her name. But even before that, I mean, I think there's a kind of a general behavior of Joe. He treats Beck like a book. And what do I mean by that? I mean, he reads her. He reads everything that she writes on all these platforms. He reads her email. He reads her texts. It's almost like his main interaction with her, even though they do have some in-person encounters, like the date and the bookshop at the very start, his primary interaction with her is reading her basically. And maybe in some ways she's more of a kind of a visual novel, as Emery was talking about in the Discord in terms of her Instagram, but he treats her as a book for the whole novel, I think. And that kind of gets summed up in that kind of the symbol of the Book of Beck at the very end. And on page 420 of my version, he says, I am the sole reader of the Book of Beck. So he kind of holds this object of her kind of collected short stories as, and that's what she becomes at the end of the novel. Okay, so that kind of treating of people as books, maybe that's kind of a phenomenon of social media or the internet today. And I also think it might be connected to the rise of the popularity of the genre of autofiction that we also kind of talked about earlier in the term. And autofiction is kind of where we learn about another person through their kind of self-reflection on their past. Okay, so I am going to kind of be getting to the end here because I did want to keep this recording short, even though I do have a tendency to ramble, so sorry if this is kind of getting out of hand again. But there was kind of one more thing from the article that I wanted to talk about a little bit. And that is kind of, I think, touched on kind of a critique maybe of us reading this novel. So the authors of our secondary source this week, they aren't very big fans of the TV show You. And I don't know if they read the novel, but I'm guessing they would probably be even less fans of the novel. So just reading their critique, they write, we argue that texts that coalesce around an endless becoming, immanence, or radical undecidability are potentially problematic for social justice projects. These texts are always in trouble, but in contrast to Mazai and Jackson's account, the trouble that they generate is not theoretically or substantively productive, nor does it challenge hegemonic practices. Instead, texts like You are always in trouble/troubled because their radical indeterminacy offers an illusory sense of open-endedness to adjudications of justice. This can create dangerous equivalencies between incommensurable political stances. And then they write that the text You ends up siding with domination, and there is actually little space left for viewer interpretation. So, yeah, I think this quote is very kind of critical of You, obviously. But that part where they say that there is actually little space left for viewer interpretation, I am kind of curious if you guys agree with that point. I mean, there is kind of a lot of space left for viewer interpretation in a text like Marie Calloway's works, where it is kind of all open to interpretation. There is no kind of way that the text is structured in a way that kind of pushes us toward a certain conclusion. But Kepnes's You does kind of, just in the way that it's framed, totally through the perspective of Joe and every kind of counter character being murdered off, it does kind of force us to kind of align ourselves with Joe a little bit, or to at least see the world from his eyes. So there is kind of that claustrophobia, I described it, or I think someone described it in the Discord of Joe's perspective. Um, and yeah, I think there's kind of an implication in the way that we read texts like these, or if we enjoy them. And again, this was something that we talked about in the Discord a little bit when Ria asked the question about the you of the title, and also the you that comes up in moments like when Joe murders Peach. Peach says you to him. So who is this you? And I do kind of agree with the reading that was going on in the Discord that this you is kind of directed at the audience. I think this is a quote from Ria. Like you said, it's like we too have played a part in this novel. So we are kind of implicated in what transpires in this novel in terms of how we kind of enjoy it. And the TV show has kind of also been kind of widely popular. You was a bestseller. So yeah, I think there is kind of an implication of us in this text, especially in the TV show. The TV show attracted, as the article talks about, a lot of kind of problematic enjoyment of it. So yeah, I did kind of like that reading that was going on in the Discord about our kind of implication in this text as well. But going back to the article where they says there is actually a little space left for viewer interpretation, one of the key differences between the TV show and the novel is that Beck's murder takes place off screen in the TV show, and it takes place, I guess, on screen in the novel by Kepnes. And when that murder actually happens, okay, so now this is kind of total spoilers. I mean, hopefully you should be getting to the end now. But yeah, total spoilers, Beck is murdered by Joe. And the murder scene is kind of very just like straight horror to me. I mean, it's the kind of the point in the novel where it gets kind of most Stephen King-like. It's just kind of a very brutal scene. And yeah, so I think there is kind of an important difference between depicting it off screen versus depicting it on screen. So when it's on screen, I do think it makes the reader have some kind of reaction or have to form some kind of interpretation or judgment of the Joe character at that point, just with how kind of brutal it is.